It's always an honor to host Salman Rushdie, tonight especially so. And I say this because if you know anything about his new book, which is called The Golden House, you know that he's produced a novel that is the perfect emotional, psychological, and political barometer of the chaotic, confounding, it's really hard to come up with enough adjectives, unthinkable times in which we currently live. The Golden House is Mr. Rushdie's 13th book. I'm sure many of you have read all or some of his earlier works, and you know that one of the constants in his writing, most notably or perhaps most famously in the Satanic Verses, but in so many of his books, is his willingness to speak truth to power, and clearly at some personal cost to him. His new novel is no exception. It's a mirror for our times, perhaps even a window into our times, into what feels like, so often these days, our tortured and fractured and somewhat unsure American soul. A reviewer said that this book could only be written by someone who loves America. Perhaps it's out of that love and fascination for our country that Mr. Rushdie is so able and so willing to take a hard look at our political and cultural underbelly, deeply examine the era of Trump when flamboyance and wealth and tragicomic, or maybe just tragic, political leadership threaten some of our most sacred values and pervert so many of our agreed-to notions about national identity, American generosity, and our sense of personal and collective security. Since its publication, reviewers have conveyed enormous excitement about The Golden House, one describing the book as, quote, part classic immigrant story, part on-the-nose political satire about America today. Another says that in his fictional take on a character who closely resembles the current American president, Mr. Rushdie, quote, finds such a perfect villain that he finds it hard to let him go. It's a treat to watch Rushdie let fly. In short, like all of Mr. Rushdie's works, this is an important, timely, and compelling book, and I hope that you all will find yourselves provoked and challenged and inspired as you read it. In conversation with Mr. Rushdie tonight will be Aminatta Forna, herself an award-winning novelist whose themes focus on dictatorship, tyranny, and civil war. She's making this the perfect person to talk to Mr. Rushdie tonight. She's also a literary critic, a professor of creative writing in England, and currently the Lannan Chair of Poetics at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Salman Rushdie and Aminatta Forna.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. You always have to live up to these introductions. Anyway, thank you so much. And thanks always to Politics and Prose. It's becoming like a habit to be here with you, all you guys. So thank you for showing up.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I hope you can enjoy this evening. I hope you can enjoy our British accents. This is an all-British, all-Commonwealth affair up here. And all-American, of course. So, I was chatting to Salman in the green room about how we were going to do this, and I said to him, so this is your 11th, isn't it? And he said, what, 11th book? And I said, no, 11th event. And he said, no, it's my, and counted them, 17th consecutive event. Yeah. So I think we have to be particularly grateful that he's here with us tonight. He has covered the country from east to west coast. He's been on the cover of Time magazine and interviewed by, yeah.
But I've actually really been on the cover of Time magazine as opposed to somebody else.
And we've done it's a Bill Mayer show as well, which you enjoyed. So yeah. I saw you post about that. So the way it's going to go this evening is we're going to chat. Salman's going to read a little bit. We do have a little surprise for you worked out. Well, half worked out. Yeah. And then round about 22:45, we'll take a pause and take some questions from you. So I want all of you to sit here and think to yourself, I will be the person who asks the first question. So let's talk about the book.
Yeah.
I reviewed it. I reviewed it for a British newspaper. At the time, I thought, oh, how very convenient. I can do both. I can review the book, and I can also interview Salman on stage. And then when I started the book, I thought, oh, my goodness, what if I hate it? This is going to be the most socially awkward interview of all time. But I'm happy to say I absolutely adored it. I was riveted by it. It is also, however, a terribly difficult book to sum up. And I saw that the New York Times made this point, the reviewer there made the same point. It's terribly hard to avoid the spoilers. So much happens at such speed. So what we're going to try and do this evening, because I know that 400 of you good souls have invested in this book, is we're going to try and talk about it without giving away the plot. But if we do, you'll have to forgive us. So, you're going to read a little bit, but we're going to talk a bit first. Yeah. In summary, we heard a little bit in the introduction. This is a book about a family called the Goldens, the patriarch Nero Golden, who arrives in New York City with his 3 sons. They have come from where we do not know. The narrator is a young man called René who lives on the opposite side of the square and watches this family. And he inveigles himself, doesn't he, into their lives with the ostensible purpose of making a documentary about them. I had a conversation with you, I don't know if you remember, a little while back. We were seated together at dinner, and we were talking about living in the States, where I have lived for the last 2 years. And we were talking about how we felt about it, and you said that it took you 3 minutes of arriving in New York to decide that you wanted to live there.
Yeah.
Can you talk to that a bit and tell us what it is about New York?
You know, well, first of all, I mean, I first went to New York when I was a kid, you know, and I was like 25 in the early 70s, and that was a very different city. You know, it was poor and dirty and a little bit dangerous, and also cheap. You know? So that downtown New York was full of young people, many of whom were creative. You know, so it was full of young artists and writers and musicians and wannabe filmmakers, etc. And I thought, you know, how great is this? And I, at that point, thought, one of these days, I just want to come and put myself here and see what happens. And then, you know, what happens is life intervenes. You get married, you have children, you have all sorts of things happen, and you don't do that. And then, 25 more years passed, and then I thought, well, if I'm ever going to try and do this, I'm not getting any younger. And I came to America without a plan, really. I mean, not knowing whether it was for 6 months or the rest of my life. And I put my bags down and thought, I'm not leaving. You know? And it's not even, I can't even say, it's just, I get up in the morning and go to the corner and get a cup of coffee and buy the New York Times and feel in a good mood. You know, and it's just that. The New York Times, which I have been defending a great deal against charges of fake news, I have to say, except when they review my books. Actually, you know, I haven't had a good review in the New York Times since I moved to New York.
Too close.
I'm thinking, what are they trying to tell me? Anyway, I'm not listening. But yeah,
that New York is a very different New York. This New York and the New York you described in the 1970s
quite
is very different
unlike.
New York.
Yeah, but, you know, it still has a kind of New Yorkness. It's still New York City, you know. Anyway, when I first moved, like almost immediately after I came over here, I wrote my novel Fury, which was also a New York novel, also about somebody arriving in Manhattan trying to get away from a past of which, in that case, of which he was ashamed. And but that was very much a novel of new arrival. You know, it was a novel of somebody just arriving and trying to find his balance in a new place. And now it's I was almost 2 decades later, and at this point I actually do feel like part of the furniture. you know. And I mean, I'm even a citizen now, so I actually have the right, as it were, to sound off. And so I thought I would.
No, go on.
No, I mean, I just thought there were I wanted to do this thing that you're not supposed to do, which is to write up against the present moment. You know, to try and write a novel about the moment in which the novel is being written. You know, and try and do something less transient than today's newspapers. You know, because I mean, if you do that wrong, then the book is valueless the next day in the way that yesterday's papers are. You know, and if you do it right, then hopefully you capture the moment. You know, hopefully for a long time. It seems to me the ideal is that there are two kinds of pleasure for the readers. One is the immediate pleasure of contemporary readers, which is the pleasure of recognition, the pleasure of saying, yeah, this is what it's like. You know, and then hopefully, you know, somewhere down the road, people pick up the book and say, oh, yes, I see, this is what it was like. You know, so you could, if you do it right, you could achieve both those things, and if you do it wrong, then that's
well,
about.
We won't know for 10 years.
Yeah, no, exactly.
But, so, I mean, the sense that I had, which you seem to be speaking to when I read the book, was, you know, there's a Chinese proverb, a cow can tell you what it feels like to stand in a field eating grass, but it can't tell you what it looks like to look at a cow standing in a field eating grass. But this book, to me, accomplishes both things. It seems to be written from a perspective that at once encapsulates the insider and the outsider. It is both what New York feels like as an insider and looks like as an outsider.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because it's been one of my ideas about writing from the earliest times, is that a writer, whoever he is, wherever he's writing about, needs to be simultaneously inside and outside. That you need to have that kind of double vision, where you have to be inside, otherwise you can't create the world with any kind of affect, you know, and you have to be outside so that you can look at it with a beady eye, you know, and I think that's true of any writer anywhere, I think, actually, but in this case, because so much of my life has been defined by migration, and here I am in New York, both inside and outside, you know, and I think it's a useful, like, double vision, useful way of seeing. Because what happened in this book is that a part of this book, the actual story, the story of Nero Golden and his family, I had thought of maybe 8 or 9 years ago without knowing that it would have anything to do with America. You know, and it really came out of India. It came because it's only chapter 3, it's like page 10, so I could tell you.
Not a big spoiler.
that the place they're trying to hide that they came from is actually my old hometown of Bombay. And where it's clear that they have been involved in very shady business. You know, and the book began for me, before I knew that they would be in New York, with that shady business. And I thought, this is an interesting story. But then I realized, because in this other part of my head, I wanted to write this social novel about New York. I realized that they were kind of the same story, because it was natural that New York would be the place they would come to try and achieve this colossal act of reinvention. You know? And so it went click. So it really is in some ways, you know, a tale of two cities. It really, because although a lot of it happens in New York, the kind of crucial backstory which explains everything happens on the other side of the world.
So, because when I was reading it, I was thinking, where did the spark of fire come from? You know, I mean, I think a novel is such a huge undertaking, sort of short story or a poem. So there are many themes in this novel above so many others. And I did think, did he actually sit there and start it in the moment? What was the first spark of fire? So you've said the first spark of fire, actually you had the idea of the Goldens from before, and then you got your next spark of fire, and then at some point you get your furnace going.
Yeah.
But so the original idea with the Goldens, where did that come from?
Well, it was interesting because, see, the setting of the novel in New York is there's this little place in Greenwich Village. There's a secret garden. There's a kind of, it actually exists, a communal garden in Greenwich Village between McDougal and Sullivan Streets. About a dozen houses on each side. And you can only access the garden if you live in one of those houses. And as it happens, I had actually the people to whom the novel is dedicated, the painter Francesco Clemente and his wife Alba, have one of those houses. And so through them, I got to know this place. They actually live in the house that Bob Dylan used to live in. And you know that old story about, in the 70s, the guy who was going through Dylan's garbage to try and find out stuff about him. Yeah. Anyway, that was the house whose garbage he was going through. And I suddenly thought that this space was like a theater. It was like, you know, like an open-air theater, and this enclosed space with people, with windows, houses all around, able to watch. You know, it's sort of like Hitchcock's Rear Window, which Renee, the narrator, who's a filmmaker, points out. So it was like an amphitheater where the characters could act out their stories. And then I thought, because it's this secluded space, it allows me to say, here's the private story of these people, you know, the private tragedy of this family. But all around it is the public tragedy of America, you know, so it like just gave me the physical separation. So I just had in my mind always this circle inside a circle, you know, this tragedy inside a tragedy. And that's what really told me how to write it.
I love the structure because, in a very writerly way, I love the structure. You think, oh, I wish I'd thought of that. So Renee is essentially considering making a documentary about these people. Where sort of starts off as almost a docudrama, then becomes, he calls it a mockumentary.
Yes.
And
like Spinal Tap.
He imagines, and there's a point in the book where you're not certain what's being imagined by Renee and what's actually taking place, because of course, really all Renee has is the visuals of them until he manages to get into the house and become involved in their lives. But at the beginning, he really just has the visuals. And I thought two things. I thought how very clever, it's a very cleverly writerly trick, because it allows you to go beyond Renee's perspective. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I thought was so brilliant about it is that that's how we look at our neighbors. That's what we're all doing. We watch our neighbors. We see them come in and come out of their house. We see them get in the car. Maybe we see the end of a remark or an argument or a car door slam, and we imagine the lives of our neighbors. Yeah,
you know, I had this awful idea about Renee when I first made him up, which was that he would be a novelist.
Yeah,
really,
I thought you might have thought that.
Really, I mean, that's a really awful idea. And it's one of the few times in my life that I've literally woken up in the night, sat up in a cold sweat, and thought, this idea sucks. and that it would be, he should be anything except a novelist. He could be a dentist. You know, that would be better. And then I went to sleep, and the next day I woke up and I thought, okay, so if he's not a novelist, who is he? And then it occurred to me that I actually knew this group of young filmmakers in downtown New York who were all kind of young men and women recently out of NYU grad school, trying to make their way, trying to make their films, you know. And I thought, well, how about if he's one of those? And the moment I thought that, the whole book like opened up. It was like just the moment at which the kind of door opened, and I could see how to write.
Found your way in.
I could see how to write the book, you know, when he was, because it allowed me to play games. Like there's moments in the novel where it kind of briefly slides into what looks like screenplay.
Yeah,
and
fade to black.
Yeah, and it uses film technique a little bit, and it just allowed me. Also, I've had this lifetime love affair with the movies, and so I have a head full of film nerdery, and I was able to give it to him. You know, so he was able to let into the novel all this stuff that I've been carrying around.
Good. Well, would you read us a little bit of it?
I'll just read what I thought. I'll just read you the beginning. This is when Nero Golden arrives in what are called the gardens, and Renee, the narrator, first encounters him. So And this, again, as you'll see, it has, the date is rather precise on which he arrives, which is the date of the inauguration of the 44th president. And I wasn't originally planning to do that, but maybe we'll talk about that in a bit. But eventually, given what happened during the course of writing the novel, it seemed to me that I needed to make that arc from that moment to this moment, you know, and make that more evident, you know. So I reshaped it in that way. Anyway, it begins like this: on the day of the new president's inauguration, when we worried that he might be murdered as he walked hand in hand with his exceptional wife among the cheering crowds, and when so many of us were close to economic ruin in the aftermath of the bursting of the mortgage bubble, and when Isis was still an Egyptian mother goddess, an uncrowned 70-something king from a faraway country arrived in New York City with his 3 motherless sons to take possession of the palace of his exile, behaving as if nothing was wrong with the country or the world or his own story. He began to rule over the neighborhood like a benevolent emperor, although in spite of his charming smile and his skill at playing his 1745 Guadagnini violin, he exuded a heavy, cheap odor, the unmistakable smell of crass, despotic danger. The kind of scent that warned us, look out for this guy, because he could order your execution at any moment if you're wearing a displeasing shirt, for example, or if he wants to sleep with your wife. The next 8 years, the years of the 44th president, were also the years of the increasingly erratic and alarming reign over us of the man who called himself Nero Golden, who wasn't really a king, and at the end of whose time there was a large and, metaphorically speaking, apocalyptic fire. I mean, that's so he's somebody who, René, when he meets him, presents him as being pretty frightening. I mean, it says how he makes clumsy efforts to be friendly, inviting people over for cocktails kind of at the wrong time of day, and trying to ruffle their children's hair and pat their dogs, and the children and dogs recoil from his touch. And he is, I have to say, in the real estate business.
So, some overlaps there.
And he acquires, as we'll see, a beautiful Eastern European wife. But in every other way, he's quite unlike anybody you might be thinking of.
Because there is, of course, another character called the Joker
who is more like... You see, what I thought is...
Who's a presidential candidate, I think we should say.
Well, there's a line in the novel where René says that what seems to have happened in America is that DC, meaning comics, is taking over DC. And so the candidate running for the presidency of the United States is the Joker, who has very, very, very white skin.
White skin, red lips, and green hair.
Likes the white skin and has unusually colored hair, yeah.
So you've been quoted as saying, I presume accurately, that you expected Trump to win.
Well, my book expected him to win. I didn't. That was a strange thing. And it's really, I mean, I think it's a thing that all of us who do this strange job know, that sometimes your work can be wiser than you are, you know. And the logic of the book just inexorably went in that direction, you know. And so I wrote it that way, thinking, well, if the other thing happens, which I would prefer to happen, I'll have to do some reshaping, you know. But I didn't.
Did you really not?
I didn't know. I mean, you know, I went along on election day and cast my vote and thought, okay, maybe tonight we'll have a woman president, you know, and was excited by it. And
I think subconsciously you must have seen the signs, because one of the things I really noticed about who called it and who didn't on Trump was that anybody who came from a country that was a new democracy or developing or had their democratic institutions threatened had a much clearer idea of how this might go.
True.
So
I mean,
at the level of the subconscious, clearly
there's a guy who actually, he makes it into the book at one point, but the moment in which I began to sort of smell a rat, really, was I was in a yellow cab in New York with a Sikh taxi driver. And he said to me that he was going to vote for Trump. And I said, really? I said, his name was like Gurinder Singh, you know? And I said, let me just take a wild guess that you come from the Punjab. And he said, yes, sir, city of Jalandhar. And I said, well, and I come from Bombay, and this gentleman doesn't like immigrants like you and me, so why would you vote for him? And he said, oh, sir, Mr. Trump, straight shooter, says what he thinks, doesn't give a fuck. And I thought he's going to win.
Yeah.
You know? Because nobody ever accused Hillary of being a straight shooter.
Yeah. It does seem a remarkable idea that it doesn't matter what somebody says, even if they say the most terrible thing to you, that somehow, even if it were the truth, that is what you would choose to elect somebody.
I mean, just horrifying. But
against your own interests.
Yes. Well, it's one of the things one of the many ways in which Karl Marx has been proven wrong by history. Because Marxism says people vote in their own interest. You know? And what we see over and over again is people voting against their own economics and other self-interest, you know, because of whatever ideological or whatever other passion is exercising their thoughts. I mean, it was shocking to watch for all of us, you know, and except for those people in the room who may be hiding their allegiance. You never know, you know. I mean, that's the scary bit about America now. You never know who did the other thing.
I think that's the thing that has shifted.
Exactly. There's some people not looking very comfortable in their seats. You know who you are.
Well, they're the lizard people. Let's, talking about the election and moving on to Russian interference, you're going to read us a little bit to introduce
about Russian interference.
Yes, the glamorous Russian...
No, what happens in the novel is that Nero gets snared at a certain point by this beautiful Russian gold digger, and much to the consternation of his other children. And before I read it, I just want to say this very weird thing has happened since the book came out. I think of her, she's called Vasilisa, which is the name taken from the legend of Baba Yaga, the witch who eats children, you know. And since the book came out, really quite a significant number of people have said to me how much they like her. You know?
I didn't want to say it, but I kind of quite do.
People kind of dig her.
Well, you know, I suppose it's in that awful straight shooter way. With Vasilisa, it's like, well, someone's just getting on with it.
No, I mean, I've been so surprised. You know, it's very odd when you're genuinely surprised by how people are reading your book. But I thought, here's the character who is the most self-seeking, amoral person in the book, and everybody likes her.
Oh, gosh, I think this is our clue. Yeah. I think this is the clue. You know where you stand with Vasilisa, I think that's the clue.
Well, it just goes to show that sometimes bad girls are more interesting than good girls.
Well, that's certainly true.
Anyway, I'll just read you a couple of little bits about her. Here is Vasilisa, the Russian girl. She is striking. One might say she is astonishing. She has long, dark hair. Her body is also long and exceptional. She runs marathons and is a fine gymnast specializing in the ribbon element of rhythmic gymnastics. She says that in her youth she came close to the Russian Olympic team. She is 28 years old. Her youth was when she was 15. Vasilisa Arsenyeva is her full name. Her region of origin is Siberia, and she claims descent from the great explorer Vladimir Arseniev himself, who wrote many books about the region, including the one that became a Kurosawa film, Dersu Uzala. But this line of descent is not confirmed because Vasilisa, as we will see, is a brilliant liar, accomplished in the arts of deceit. She says that she was raised in the heart of the forest, the immense taiga forest that covers much of Siberia. And her heroine as she grew up was the great gymnast Nellie Kim, half Korean, half Tatar. She was far away from politics, though she did hear about the fall of the Berlin Wall when she was 9 years old. She was happy because she had begun to look at a few magazines and wanted to go to America and be adored and send US dollars back to her family at home. This is what she has done. She has flown the coop. Here she is in America, in New York City, and also now and often in Florida. and she is much admired and making money doing the work the beautiful do. Many men desire her, but she is not looking for a mere man. She wants a protector, a czar. This is Vasilisa in Miami. She is blonde now. She is about to meet her czar. I'll just skip. So it's New Year's Eve, right? And in Florida. And there's dancing. And Vasilisa ends up dancing with Nero Golden. And that works. New Year's is for dancing, and when the music stops, she commands him, go home and sleep. I want you rested for when we really begin. And he obediently walks back to his bed like a good boy with his sons looking on in astonishment. The next night, he empties the apartment and orders dinner, alone on the 7th floor, looking down at the tops of the palm trees, the small half-moon of beach, and the bright water beyond. Dinner has been delivered by motor launch from a fine dining establishment on the south side of the Miami River and has been set out on the dining table. There is ice and caviar and vodka and wine. At precisely the appointed time, she comes to his door, gift-wrapped in gold, with a bow at the back of her dress so he can easily unwrap her. They agree that they do not want to eat. Here is Vasilisa the Fair giving herself to her czar. Just skip a little bit. She asks him what he likes, what he wants. He is the king. He knows what he wants, and everything you want, she says, when you want it, it's yours. And then on the 3rd night, she discusses business. This is not a shock to him. This makes things easier. Business is his comfort zone. She produces a printed card the size of a postcard with boxes to tick. Let's go through the details, she says. Obviously, I should not stay in the house on McDougal. That is your family home for yourself and your sons, and I am not your wife, so I am not your family. So you can choose, A, a residence in the West Village for convenience, for ease of access, or B, on the Upper East Side for a little distance, a little more discretion. Very well, B. This is my preference also. And then the size of the apartment. 2 bedrooms minimum, no? And maybe one more as art studio space? Good. And will I own it, or is it a rental? And if so, for how many years? Okay, think about it. We proceed to the car, and I leave this to you completely. A, Mercedes convertible, B, BMW 6 Series, C, Lexus SUV. Oh, A, so nice, I love you. The question arises of where I will have accounts. A, Bergdorf, B, Barney's, C, both of the above. Fendi, Gucci, Prada, this goes without saying. Equinox, Soho House, you have the checklist. The subject of a monthly allowance. I must comport myself in a manner that befits you. You see, the categories are 10, 15, 20. I recommend generosity. Yes, in thousands of dollars, darling. Perfect. You will not regret. I will be perfect for you. I speak English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Mandarin, and Russian. I ski, water ski, surf, run, and swim. The flexibility of my gymnastic youth, this I retain. In the coming days, I will know better how to satisfy you than you know yourself. And if equipment is needed to assist this, if a room must be constructed, a room for us, let us call it a playroom, I will make sure it is done immaculately and with the greatest discretion. I will never look at another man. No other man will touch me, nor will I tolerate any inappropriate advances or remarks. This is all for now, but there is one more matter for later. This is the matter of marriage, she says, lowering her voice to its huskiest and most alluring level. As your wife, I will have honor and standing. Only as your wife will I truly and fully have this. Until then, yes, I am happy. I am the most loyal of women, but my honor is important to me. You understand. Of course, you are the most understanding man I have ever met. So, he's screwed.
Well, I mean, you say that, but actually, to me, there was a tenderness in that relationship between the two of them. And Vasilisa is, she is loyal. She says she's loyal, and she remains loyal.
She's a perfect girlfriend.
I think is why. And
if you could do the deal.
You capture, well, in a sense there's something that you capture there which is, it would have been very easy to make the relationship utterly one of mutual exploitation, but in fact that isn't what happens.
No.
There is tenderness in the relationship, and he does grow to rely on her.
Well, I think both of them, are presented initially as these kind of comic monsters, and I think in both cases, as the novel progresses, you begin to feel fonder of them and more compassionate for them. At least I hope you do, because that was my intention, to kind of shift the reader's perception of them from being one-dimensional to being complicated.
Yeah, I think that works really well. And the sons, let's talk a bit about the sons, because I'm keen to get to our little surprise and then get some questions from you. But the three sons, Lucius Appules, who becomes Apu. Well, first of all, the father changes all the names before they leave Bombay.
Yeah, they take all these
gives them
names,
a new identity.
Names from classical antiquity.
And then as each son stays longer in New York, as the family stay longer in New York, another shift changes. So they kind of shift their external identity, don't they? And then their internal identity starts to shift along with the names. So Petronius becomes Petia, Dionysus becomes D. Now, I'll just tell you briefly that Apu is the artist, and he's the one who gets this desperate yearning to go back to Bombay.
Yeah.
Petia has
brain
freeze.
If it's not Asperger's, it's high-functioning autism anyway.
Yeah, and he also is terrified of leaving his own
And he's
space.
agoraphobic, which is sometimes a consequence of HFA.
And then there's Dionysus, who is D, and he begins to question issues of his own sexual identity, doesn't he? Yeah. So we'll talk about identity in a second, but just to talk briefly about Apu and his yearning to go back to Bombay. Yeah. Is that the migrant's curse, do you think? That desire always to go back?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, even if you know that the place isn't there to go back to. In the novel before this, the character of Mr. Geronimo, the gardener who's living in New York, he understands that the tragedy is not that you can't go back, because you can go back. You can buy a plane ticket and go back. But it's that the thing that you want to go back to isn't like that anymore. So the there isn't there anymore. And I think for migrants that's particularly sharp and poignant, but I think it's actually true for most human beings.
Yes, it's about time and memory and change.
Yeah, because home is an idea not only of place but of time. And as time marches on, that particular sense of home isn't there to go back to. And I think for him, he's of the three sons the one who is most distressed by the act of migration and most anxious to see if he can reverse it. And the others have different problems, but that's his problem. Yeah.
And so Dionysus actually finds a new self in New York. And so we're going to read, this is our surprise, we're going to do a double reading.
It's her idea. So blame her. Well, there's just this
I'm going to read from the British edition, by the way.
Well, I think it's the page numbers are the same. Yes, that's the British edition, she says jingoistically.
Page 115. Right. Now, we haven't rehearsed this, so you're just going to have to take it as it comes. Also, we're not doing accents, are we?
No, we're not doing accents. But basically what happened is that the youngest son, who goes by the name of D, is genuinely very torn and conflicted about gender identity. And so these are two women that he becomes involved with. One is his girlfriend, Ria, who works at a place I'm rather proud to have invented, which is the Museum of Identity.
I like that.
Which I think, if it doesn't exist now, it will any minute. And anyways, and then there's a friend of theirs who is a singer called Ivy Manuel, and they are basically talking to him about the kind of issue of gender identity. Shall I start?
Yeah, you'll start.
Doesn't matter which of them is talking, it's a dialogue. Don't think about surgery, the women say. Don't even let it cross your mind. We are nowhere near that point yet. When this scene is filmed, the women actors can decide who says which line. But for now, let's say this is Ria speaking, and then Ivy, and so on.
You need to work out who you are. For this, there is professional help.
Right now, you could be TG, TS, TV, CD. Whatever feels right to you. Transgender, transsexual, transvestite, cross-dresser. No need to go one step further than what feels right.
For this, there is professional help.
It used to be people got labels in front of their names, like T.S. Ivy or C.D. Ria. And then also there was sex change. Look, here comes sex change Sally. The whole trans world has grown up now. Now she's just Sally or whoever, no compartmentalization.
You should think about pronouns, however. Words are important. If you're giving up he, who steps in? You could choose they. If you decide you don't identify as either female or male, they equals unknown gender identity, very private.
There's also Z.
There's also a.
There's also here, xi, hen, vi, ne, per, fon, and mx.
I'm glad you did that bit, because I didn't think I could pronounce them all. You see, there's a lot.
Von, for example, is a mixture of that and one.
Mix is instead of ms and is pronounced mix. This is one I personally like.
It's more than pronouns, naturally. Some of this I told you at the museum that first time. Words are important. You need to be certain of your identity unless your certainty is that you're uncertain, in which case maybe you're gender fluid.
Or maybe trans-feminine, because you're born male, identify with many aspects of femaleness, but don't feel you actually are a woman.
The word woman is being detached from biology. Also the word man.
Or if you don't identify with womanness or manness, maybe you're non-binary.
So there's no rush. There's a lot to think about.
A lot to learn.
Transition is like translation. You're moving across from one language into another.
Some people pick up languages easily. For others, it's hard. But for this, there is professional help.
Think about the Navajo. They recognize 4 genders. As well as male and female, there are the Nadlihi, the 2 spirits born as male but functioning in the role of a woman, or vice versa, obviously.
You can be what you choose to be.
Sexual identity is not a given. It's a choice.
D has remained silent up to now. Finally, he speaks. Didn't the argument used to be the other way around? Being gay wasn't a choice, it was a biological necessity. So now we're saying it's a choice after all.
Choosing an identity, Ivy Manuel says, is not like choosing cereal at the supermarket.
To say choosing can also be a way of saying being chosen.
But it's a choice now?
For this, there is professional help. Oh, sorry. With help, your choice will become clear to you.
It will become necessary.
So then it won't be a choice.
This is just a word. Why are you getting so hung up on this? It's just a word.
Blackout.
I mean, I had to, one of the interesting things about writing this character was that I had to really learn this language. And it's really, that's a kind of slightly satirical version of the language, but it is a very complicated language that people use now. In colleges, students come into class and they have their pronouns, and you have to use those.
I wonder, a lot of people in our generation are a little bit baffled by the detail of gender identity, just generally the discussion about identity now. I grew up, and one of the wonderful things I think that this book says is, I grew up with many identities, and I never really found that confusing.
No.
And you say in the book, well, actually, let me tell you something I do with my students first. I teach at Georgetown University, and my students come from all over the world. And one of the things we do when we're talking about identity is I say there's a little trick a therapist that I just used to dog walk with taught me, and to get people to think about who they were in their own eyes, as opposed to who they were in anybody else's eyes. And he said, I'm going to ask you 10 questions, and you are going to answer these questions without hesitation, without repetition, and as fast as you can, right? And you're going to make no repetitions, you're going to make the answer different each time. Now, you don't have to do it, you just have to think about it. First question, who are you? Second question, who are you? Third question, who are you? Fourth question, who are you? Now, when I did it with my students, the really interesting thing is, out of 18 students, only 3 identified race or nationality in the top 4 answers, right? Only 3, and I don't think any of them put gender either. They all talked about their relationships, their occupations, their aspirations. You know, they talked about who they were in their family. They talked about what they did. I'm a student. I'm a medical student. I'm going to be. But they never talked about themselves the way that they were probably perceived from the outside.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You see, one of the things there's been a bee in my bonnet for a long time, and I think it's one of the things that the art of the novel has always been really good at knowing and communicating, is that we are all an enormous bag of different identities. You know, we are not one thing, we are many things. You know, in the way that famously Walt Whitman said, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. You know, the idea that identity is not homogeneous, that it's heterogeneous, you know, and that we behave and are completely different in different circumstances. So the way in which we are with our children is not the way in which we are with our employers. And the way we are with our employers is not the way we are with our lovers, you know, and so on. So we all know this, you know.
Yes.
And we all know also that we can define ourselves, we can say about ourselves maybe 20 things that would all be equally true. We can say we are overweight, or that we are short, or that we are Yankee fans, or that the 6 people in the room, voted Republican. You know what I mean? And all these things are equally good definitions of ourselves, and we are all those things together.
Yeah.
You know? And the novel has always known that human beings are like this, you know, and that this narrowing, this idea of having to define ourselves more and more narrowly is just a great mistake. And it may be one of the few remaining reasons to read novels, is to remind ourselves that human beings are actually like this. They're actually complicated, contradictory, and many things at once.
Yeah, that the discussion is and, but, not either or.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to questions in a minute. I'll just, my favorite line in the novel is, to be plural, to be multiform, is a singular thing.
Thank you.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. All right. There's microphones over there, which you need to get to.
You're taking over, yes?
Yeah, right.
We'll take questions now. There's a microphone here and a microphone on the other aisle.
And we'll go that way, yeah. All right.
I'm sure you're all good people, but we have a strong preference for questions over statements.
Hi. In terms of your writing process, what is the most nourishing aspect of your process? What most feeds your creative process, storytelling?
What most feeds it?
Yeah.
Goodness, I wish I knew. Because I'd have written a lot more books if I knew the correct diet. What I think I look for when I'm trying to find a book to write, I'm looking for 2 things. I'm looking for a kind of conversation inside myself, whatever is bugging me at the moment. And I'm also looking for a larger conversation, you know, outside myself. What is bugging everybody else at the moment. And I try to find intersection points. I try and find a point where the conversation inside me in some way connects to the conversation outside me, you know, and I try and put the book on that crossroads. You know, that's certainly what I did in this book. You know, that it seems to me there were these two narratives, one of which was personal and the other of which was public. You know, and I tried to find the intersection point in which I was able to tell both those stories. Yes, sir.
You said a minute ago that some people are like a comic monster and one-dimensional, and then later we find out more about them, we grow fonder. In the same spirit as what you were talking about a second ago, about how people are all multidimensional, do you see multi-dimensions in our current president, or is he this comic monster? And what will we find out about him later that will make us grow fonder?
That's a good question.
I mean, excellent question. I do find it very hard to see Mr. Trump as three-dimensional. He does seem flat rather than round, to use an old idea of character. That he's in fact a caricature that he himself has invented and now is obliged to inhabit. And he does it pretty well. He's good at one thing, which is you know, getting a crowd to cheer and follow him. What he's not good at is everything else. And we were saying before backstage that it's as if, you know, two people apply for a job. One of them is really bad at the job interview, but could probably do the job. And the other one is pretty good at the job interview, but is completely incompetent at doing the job. And unfortunately, that's the person who won. I mean, one of the reasons why the only moment of this book, or the only bit of this book, which somewhat departs from conventional realism, is the character of the Joker, because he's a comic book character, you know, and it's because I thought that was the only way I could write about him. I also thought, you know, that in a deck of cards, the two cards that misbehave are the Joker and the Trump. They're the two cards that don't behave like the other cards. So I thought, well, I don't want the Trump, so I better have the Joker. Yeah, comic book villains, you know. I mean, one of the things I thought was, here is a story about, as real as I can make it, but real people in a real place and time, facing the real problems of their lives, some of which we've been talking about, you know. But then if you rise up to the level of power, suddenly you find grotesques and cartoon figures, and how difficult it is for us in this moment to be real people facing our real problems, but being governed by cartoons, being governed by comic book grotesques. And if the book has a political message, I guess that's it.
So, Mr. Rushdie, you caricatured Indira Gandhi's emergency very well in Midnight's Children. And in this book, I have not read it yet. And one sentence stays in my head is, Levia-lipped son of the widow for Sanjay Gandhi. So do you have any such metaphors here? And the next concern I have is, we are all struggling how to get into the narrative in a situation like where we are in the United States today. Would you like to bring back Gopi and Bagha from Satyajit Ray movies to narrate United States?
Well, I don't know how to answer that really. I mean, Gopi and Bagha are comic characters who I love in a wonderful children's film, but I don't know that they're capable of running the country any better than anyone else. Except that they speak in rhyme. That's a skill. Everything they say is in rhyme. I like them, but no, look, I in my books have sometimes taken on public figures. You're right, you know, and Indira Gandhi was the first of those. Indira Gandhi is a much more impressive figure than Donald Trump. I mean, she actually had some...
I agree.
I mean, she actually had some weight to her as a person. She did a very bad thing in the mid-70s when she tried to suspend democracy, and the country punished her for it. You know? But she was an impressive figure, and I don't find that to be possible to say about the 45th President of the United States, whose name, by the way, does not occur in this novel, which was a deliberate act.
I'm going to take, well, let's take these last three questions and we'll close there, shall we? Yeah.
All right, yeah.
I'd like to ask if your books, especially the novels, talk to each other.
Do they talk to me?
Do they talk to each other?
Each other? You know, sometimes there's two things to say about that. One is that I've always thought when I finish a book that I'm completely done with it. I have no further interest in that group of people, etc. But what has happened to me more than once is that when much later writing a different book, a character from an earlier book reappears. So for instance, in Midnight's Children, there's only really one white man. There's the Englishman from whom the main family buy their house in Bombay and where the narrator grows up, called William Methwold, and he's there for a very brief moment of time in Midnight's Children. Many years later, like 18 years later, when I was writing The Ground Beneath Her Feet, I was writing about the Parsi community in Bombay, the Zoroastrian community, which has always been very Anglophile. And the old patriarch of the family in that book was like that. And I wanted him to have a close English friend. And I suddenly thought, well, I've got one. And so William Methwold reappears in The Ground, and is actually a much bigger character in The Ground Beneath Her Feet than in the novel in which I originally made him up. And that was completely unexpected. You know, and there have been one or two other cases of characters jumping from book to book. So it does happen, yeah. Always to my surprise, because I genuinely think when I'm done with a book that I'm done with all that, you know. I mean, I don't know what happens to the characters the day after the novel ends, you know. Unlike, you know, Dickens used to be obsessed with knowing all that. And so at the end of his novels, he would tell you what happened to all the characters, including the dogs, etc. But I usually don't think like that. But as I say, on 2 or 3 occasions, people have jumped from one book to another.
Ooh, Vasilisa might come back.
You know? Yeah, Vasilisa 2.0. Maybe she'll get her own series.
Let's take the last 2, yeah.
Thank you both. I'm most curious as I pick up the book about this latitude that you create between the contemporary pieces that are pulled from today's headlines, that is true, just so thinly veiled, and the novel capacity, the fictionalization that you bring to things. I'm curious about the tools or the mechanism or the calculus you use to sort out how much of which and where.
You know, the answer is instinct. That's really the only answer there is. You have to just judge whether what you're doing is of only passing interest, only ephemeral, or if there's some way of making it mean more than that, you know. And it's my instinct against the readers, you know, and in a way you have to judge whether I did it right or wrong, you know. I mean, when you're doing it, you think you know what you're doing, but it doesn't mean you actually know what you're doing. It just means you fool yourself that you know what you're doing. I mean, books, I've often thought with books that you begin at the stupid end of the book, where you don't know anything, you know, and you try and get to the smart end of the book, you know, where you at least can give the illusion that you knew what you were doing. You know, but there's no guiding principle other than your instinct. You know, Hemingway had this wonderful line, which in his Paris Review interview, where he said that what a writer needs to have is a very good shit detector. because what he meant is if you don't know when it's bad, you don't know when it's good. You know, and I think that ability to say to yourself, no, this is not good, you know, it's very, very important, because without that, you can't judge when it is okay, you know. And so, but it's just that, it's some kind of inner private critic that tells you whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And you have to, in the end, trust it. It's all you got.
Thank you for sharing that instinct with us.
Thank you.
Hi. We're living in a very bizarre era, and I'm wondering, as a fiction writer, how do you keep your writing fresh and believable in a time when truth has become stranger than fiction?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think it's a very good question, and it's a question that actually affected the way in which this book is written. Because, you know, the novel before this one is very, very fabulist. You know, 2 years, 8 months, 28 nights, which, if you do the math, is 1,001 nights, is a kind of 1,001 nights fantasy of New York. And it has genies and, you know, flying urns, genies riding on flying urns. And almost immediately that I finished it, and all this nonsense was starting, you know, I thought maybe no more of that. I thought maybe that in that book I had pushed that kind of writing as far as I wanted to take it, and maybe it was time to do something opposite, you know, and that paradoxically, exactly as you say, paradoxically, at a time when there is so much falsehood, falsification, fakery out there, maybe it's time for the novel to do something which the novel has always been very good at doing, which is to try and re-establish between the writer and the reader some agreement about what the truth actually is. You know, and if you do it properly, this is one of the great virtues of the novel. You read the novel, and you see what the world that the writer is giving you, and you think, yes, that is the world. You know, and that agreement, you know, is one of the profoundest gifts of literature, that it can recreate our sense of the real. And I think maybe we need that sense of the real to be recreated. And maybe it's a thing that writers can offer. Maybe it's one reason for writing novels these days.
Wonderful. Stay there. We're not going anywhere.
You're going to make the final divide. All right, make the final divide. All right, go on.
Can I just say thank you so much to Politics and Prose for bringing Salman here again. Thank you very much to you. You've been fabulous. And let's give Mr. Rushdie one more round of applause. Sir Rushdie, one more round of applause. And